He was just a tired single dad, standing on a dim apartment balcony after putting his daughter to sleep, when his quiet female neighbor leaned in and whispered 5 words that froze him to the bone. "I wish someone loved me like that." What happened next shattered everything he believed about loneliness, love, and second chances. Before this story pulls you under, hit subscribe, because stories like this don't just entertain, they change the way you see people forever. The night it began was ordinary in the most exhausting way, the kind of night only single parents truly understand, when silence finally arrives not as peace but as a fragile truce after bedtime negotiations, spilled juice, forgotten homework, and whispered reassurances that monsters do not live in closets, and Daniel Carter stood barefoot on the narrow balcony of his apartment holding a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee, staring at the glow of streetlights below and wondering how a man could feel so full of love for one small person and yet so empty everywhere else at the same time. Because loving his 8-year-old daughter Lily was the easiest thing he had ever done, but surviving everything that came after his divorce felt like learning how to breathe again with only half a lung, and the apartment complex around him hummed softly with distant televisions, muted laughter, and the anonymous lives of neighbors he barely knew, except for the woman next door, the one he noticed not because she was loud or dramatic but because she seemed to exist in the same quiet margins he did, moving through hallways with careful steps, always polite, always distant, always carrying a sadness that didn't announce itself but lingered like a shadow that never quite left her heels. And tonight, as Daniel leaned on the railing thinking about unpaid bills and parent-teacher meetings and the way Lily still asked why mommy didn't call anymore, the sliding door beside him opened and there she was, Emily Rhodes, wrapped in an oversized sweater that looked like it had once belonged to someone else, her hair loosely tied, her face bare of makeup, her eyes tired in a way that spoke of long nights spent staring at ceilings rather than sleeping beneath them, and they exchanged the same familiar nod they always did, the silent acknowledgement of two adults coexisting in parallel worlds, until Lily's bedroom window behind Daniel glowed softly and he smiled without realizing it, because inside she was sleeping clutching the old stuffed rabbit he had sewn back together after her mother left, and Emily noticed that smile, really noticed it, the way it softened him, the way it came from somewhere deep and protective and pure, and something in her cracked open because she had not been smiled at like that in years, not by anyone who meant it, and before Daniel could retreat back into his thoughts she spoke, her voice low, almost hesitant, "She asleep?" And he nodded, surprised but not uncomfortable, and said yes, she finally was, and Emily stepped a little closer to the railing, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender of her laundry soap, and for a few moments they stood there in silence, not awkward but heavy, like two people sharing the same unspoken weather. And then she exhaled, a sound that carried more than air, and leaned in just slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt too intimate for such a small movement, and she said, "I wish someone loved me like that," and the words hit Daniel harder than he expected, because they were not flirtatious or playful or manipulative, they were raw and aching and honest, and he turned to look at her and saw tears she hadn't allowed to fall yet, and in that instant he understood something dangerous and profound, that loneliness does not always scream, sometimes it whispers, and before he could respond she took another step closer, not touching him, not invading his space, just closing the emotional distance between two people who had both been surviving instead of living, and Daniel's heart began to race, not with desire but with recognition, because Emily's eyes held the same question his own reflection asked him every morning, "Is this all there is now?" And he cleared his throat and told her that Lily was his whole world, that loving her wasn't something he earned, it was something he was lucky enough to be given, and Emily nodded, swallowing hard, and admitted that she used to believe love came easily to everyone else, that she used to believe if she did everything right it would stay, but that belief had been shattered when her fiancé died suddenly 3 years ago, a fact Daniel had never known, a grief she had never shared, and she confessed that watching him with Lily every day had been both beautiful and unbearable, because it reminded her of the future she lost, and Daniel felt the weight of that confession settle between them like a fragile glass ornament, one wrong move from shattering, and the night stretched on as they talked quietly, sharing pieces of themselves they hadn't planned to give, until footsteps echoed in the hallway and Emily pulled back, embarrassed, apologetic, retreating into herself as quickly as she had stepped forward, leaving Daniel alone again on the balcony with a heart that would not slow down, because he didn't yet know that this moment, this whisper, this almost touch, was only the beginning of a story that would test his loyalty, reopen old wounds, and force him to choose between the safety of the life he built for his daughter and the terrifying possibility that love, real love, might still be waiting for both of them just beyond the walls they had built to survive. Morning came too fast, the kind of morning that doesn't ease into the day but crashes through it with alarms, spilled cereal, and the quiet panic of realizing you dreamed something so vivid you're not sure it stayed in the night. And Daniel woke with Emily's whisper still echoing in his head, The memory of how close she had stood replaying itself in fragments between helping Lily find her missing shoe and reminding himself, firmly, that whatever spark he thought he felt had to be nothing more than empathy, because single dads did not get to make reckless emotional choices, not when a child depended on their stability, and yet as he walked Lily to school he caught himself scanning balconies and hallways like a man looking for proof that something real had happened, proof arriving when Emily stepped out of her door just as he passed, holding a paper bag and wearing that same oversized sweater, her eyes meeting his for a half-second too long before she smiled, small and careful, and said good morning like nothing extraordinary had occurred, though both of them felt the shift, the invisible line that had been crossed, and Daniel answered in kind, his voice steady even as his thoughts were not, and Lily waved enthusiastically at Emily because children recognized kindness instinctively, something Emily returned with a softness that made Daniel ache in a place he hadn't visited since before his divorce, and the rest of the day unfolded with forced normalcy, emails from work, deadlines, grocery lists, the dull rhythm of survival, until late afternoon brought the knock he had not expected, sharp and insistent, cutting through the apartment like a blade, and when he opened the door his past stood there in the form of Rachel, his ex-wife, polished and composed, her smile brittle, her eyes calculating, a woman who had once promised forever and left behind legal documents and unanswered questions instead. And Lily squealed in confusion and joy because children did not understand distance the way adults did, and Rachel swept her into an embrace that felt practiced, rehearsed, and Daniel's chest tightened as old anger flared alongside something worse, hope he didn't trust, because Rachel announced she was back in town for good, that things hadn't worked out the way she thought they would, that she missed her daughter, and that she wanted to talk about co-parenting, a word that landed like a threat disguised as peace, and as they sat across from each other in the small living room Daniel noticed Emily's door across the hall open just a crack, noticed her retreat quickly when she realized she was witnessing something private, but the knowledge that she had seen Rachel, that she had seen this complication enter his life, made him feel exposed in a way he couldn't articulate, and Rachel's visit ended with promises to call and smiles that didn't reach her eyes, leaving Daniel exhausted and unsettled, wondering what chaos her return would bring, because Rachel had never done anything without an angle, and that night, after Lily was asleep again, he stepped onto the balcony out of habit, needing air, needing quiet, and found Emily already there, her hands wrapped around a mug like a shield, her face tight with concern, and she didn't ask questions at first, she just stood beside him, the space between them charged but respectful, until he spoke, admitting that his ex-wife was back, that things were about to get complicated, and Emily nodded slowly, confessing that she had overheard enough to understand, and then, with a vulnerability that startled him, she told him the rest of her story, the parts she had never shared with anyone in that building, how after her fiancé died she had discovered debts he had hidden, how grief had been followed by betrayal, how she lost not only the man she loved but the future she thought they were building, and how she moved into this apartment to disappear, to live quietly where no one expected anything from her. And Daniel listened, realizing that what he felt wasn't attraction alone but recognition of a fellow survivor, someone who understood how love could both save and destroy, and as the night deepened she revealed the secret that had kept her guarded, that she was planning to leave, that in 3 weeks she would move away for a job she hadn't told anyone about, a fresh start she believed she needed because staying close to him and Lily was becoming too painful, and Daniel felt something twist sharply inside him. Fear mixed with disappointment, because he had not allowed himself to imagine a future involving Emily and yet the idea of her absence already felt like a loss, and before he could stop himself he asked why she hadn't said anything, and she answered honestly that she didn't trust herself not to stay for the wrong reasons, not to cling to something beautiful simply because it reminded her of what she had lost, and that confession hung between them, heavy and unresolved, until voices echoed from the courtyard below and Emily stepped back again, retreating into distance, leaving Daniel with a terrible realization. His life was about to split in multiple directions at once, pulled by a woman from his past who wanted back in, a woman from his present who was already preparing to leave, and a daughter whose heart would feel every tremor of his choices, and as he stood alone under the dim lights he understood that love was no longer a simple thing he could ignore or postpone, because whether he chose to act or not, everything was already changing. The truth has a way of surfacing when people are most afraid of it, and for Daniel it arrived not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet unraveling of patterns he had once ignored, because over the next few days Rachel inserted herself into Lily's routine with unsettling ease, volunteering for school pickups she never followed through on, promising weekends that quietly disappeared into work emergencies, and speaking about rebuilding trust without ever acknowledging how thoroughly she had broken it, and Daniel watched his daughter's excitement rise and fall like a fragile tide, each disappointment carving something small and permanent into her heart, until one evening Lily asked in a voice far too calm for her age whether mommy was going to leave again, and Daniel felt something inside him harden into resolve, because protecting his child meant more than offering forgiveness that hadn't been earned, and as he tucked Lily into bed he realized that love was not about who claimed the title of family but who consistently showed up, a realization that echoed painfully when he stepped into the hallway afterward and found Emily sitting on the stairs, her suitcase beside her, her eyes rimmed red but steady, because she was leaving early, unable to handle the slow goodbye she feared would weaken her, and the sight of that suitcase struck Daniel harder than any argument could have, because it made the loss tangible, irreversible, and he sat beside her without thinking, close enough that their shoulders touched, neither pulling away, and she confessed that she had accepted the job across the country, that staying here had begun to feel like living in the shadow of something she wanted but didn't believe she deserved, and Daniel surprised himself by telling her the truth he had been avoiding, that he didn't want her to go, not because he needed her to fill a void but because she had become part of his and Lily's sense of home, a presence that felt safe and genuine, and Emily closed her eyes, tears finally falling, admitting that watching him fight for his daughter had reminded her of the kind of love she once dreamed of, the kind that didn't vanish when things became difficult, and for a moment they stayed there, suspended between what was and what could be, until Rachel's voice echoed down the hallway calling Daniel's name, sharp and possessive, shattering the intimacy like glass, and something in Emily's expression changed then, not jealousy but clarity, because she stood, lifted her suitcase, and said quietly that he needed to choose his reality, not his comfort, words that followed her as she walked away toward the exit, leaving Daniel alone with a decision he could no longer postpone, and when Rachel confronted him moments later demanding explanations, demanding reassurance, he finally spoke with a calm that surprised even himself, telling her that co-parenting would happen on Lily's terms, not hers, that inconsistency was not love, and that he would not allow his daughter to be an emotional safety net for an adult who hadn't learned to stay, and Rachel's anger flared, accusations flying, but beneath them Daniel saw what he had always avoided. She wanted control, not connection, and when she left in fury he felt relief instead of regret, because clarity, though painful, was lighter than confusion, and that night Daniel lay awake listening to Lily's breathing through the wall, knowing he had lost Emily and possibly peace all at once, until the sound of a knock startled him near dawn, soft but deliberate, and when he opened the door Emily stood there again, suitcase gone, eyes swollen but determined, because she had missed her flight on purpose, admitting that running away felt too much like letting grief decide her future, and that she wanted to stay not because she was lonely but because she believed in what she felt growing between them, and Daniel didn't rush to embrace her, didn't make promises he couldn't keep, but he invited her in, poured coffee as the sky lightened outside, and told her everything, about Rachel, about Lily, about his fears of loving again and failing twice as hard, and Emily listened, not trying to fix him, not asking for guarantees, only offering presence, and when Lily woke and padded sleepily into the living room she stopped short at the sight of Emily, her face brightening, and Emily knelt without hesitation, greeting her gently, and Lily wrapped her arms around Emily's neck with the unfiltered trust of a child who sensed safety, and Daniel watched the two of them with a feeling that settled deep and steady in his chest, not explosive, not reckless, but real, because love did not arrive with grand gestures or whispered fantasies, it arrived in moments like this, quiet mornings, shared honesty, and the courage to stay when leaving would be easier, and as sunlight filled the apartment Daniel understood that the whisper on the balcony had not been a temptation but an invitation, not to romance alone but to a deeper kind of love rooted in choice, responsibility, and healing, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart he felt something close to certainty, that broken people could build something whole, that children could witness love without fearing abandonment, and that sometimes the bravest thing two lonely hearts could do was step closer and stay.